Okay, so we're going to begin in a few minutes. Again, I would encourage people in the back if you want to move up to the front. My name is Lawrence Freeman, and I work on the LaRouche campaign out of Baltimore, Maryland. And we're very happy to be here today. And we know many people in the audience are friends of ours for a long time. So I think this is more of a family affair than a political event at this point. But to open the proceedings, we're going to have some opening remarks from the Birmingham City Councilman Roosevelt Bell.
Thank you very much, Larry. On behalf of my colleagues on the council and our Mayor Richard Arrington Jr., it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today as you visit with us here in Birmingham. As you can see, we're involved in an annual meeting of the National League of Cities. We serve as the chairman of Transportation and Communications for the Birmingham City Council, as well as chairman of the State League of Transportation and Communications. I've had the privilege for many years, not many years, but several years, to observe the works and teachings of Lyndon LaRouche. I think it's a refreshing viewpoint for thought. I had a young man that I talked to out in the hall just a while ago, and he was asking me about the meeting and the contents of the meeting. I had the privilege of asking Mr. LaRouche the same question prior to the meeting. I asked him what was his expectations of the meeting here and what really he would be talking about, and he said, I just take them like they come and tell it like it is. So I'm pleased to be here in this meeting. Again, on behalf of our colleagues in the city of Birmingham, I want to welcome Mr. LaRouche and all of his friends to our city. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you, Councilman. I just want to give people a few bits of information because the media has refused to tell you this. In fact, the media has lied to you virtually everything they've said about Mr. LaRouche. First of all, we're on the ballot June 4th in the Democratic primary in Alabama, as we will be on the ballot by the end of the primary period on 30 states. Up to this point, we have now gotten over 1.5 million votes in these primaries, and we expect to get several thousands, tens of thousands more. Of course, you haven't been told that by the media. It's also the case that Mr. LaRouche will be giving his 4th national TV show on June 2nd on the Fox network. It'll be 8:30 Central Standard Time. And as some of you may know, Mr. LaRouche has been very active in Alabama over the last couple of weeks. We were at the New South Coalition meeting 2 weekends ago. This current weekend, we were at the Joe Reed's Alabama Democratic Conference, and we have many friends in Alabama for many years. We are committed and serious about this campaign, not just the election, but what happens after the election in building a movement to change this country. And we feel very strong that the center of that movement will be Alabama because of its great history in civil rights. And we will not give up, and we're going to be fighting with you in Alabama all the way. And for us, this is a very serious commitment. And with that, I'll tell a joke I heard over the weekend about a breakfast. You know, when you have ham and eggs, chicken contributes to the breakfast, but the pig is committed. And we're committed to Alabama. And with that, I bring you Lyndon LaRouche, a great statesman and economist in Alabama.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, especially in view of the composition of the audience, it's important, I think, that I concentrate on the problem in a special way. Since you're all leaders of organizations and been in the movement for a number of years, and that we discuss things which are of common interest as problems of organizing and perspective. We have, let me take it from the top down, and let me say first of all something which situates it, and you'll see what the importance is apart from the personal touch, which is personally important to me. Yesterday, I went to the hospital to see our dear friend Amelia Boynton Robinson, who had broken a hip in a fall down the stairs trying to work on the selection process for the problem of selecting a Democratic senator for the state of Alabama. Now, after I heard the bad news, I heard that it was just a broken hip, in a sense, and I said, well, that's just all it is for Amelia. She's tough. She'll come out of this all right fairly quickly. And sure enough, she did. She's probably home today. I haven't had a chance to talk to her today, but I saw her yesterday at the hospital, and she said she's leaving, and we've got some friends in there to visit with her for a few days, make sure she behaves herself. You know, it's tough to get her to behave herself. But Amelia, of course, has been with us for a long time, and before her husband died and so forth, and down here. And over the years, over the past 15 years in particular, largely through what Amelia has done, we got to know most of the people of importance in the state of Alabama, and some adjoining states as well. So Alabama has a very special importance. And I want to situate that, as I've said to a number of people earlier, as to what this problem is. See, we have in this country 3 generations. And the key to organizing in this country is to recognize you've got 3 adult generations. And if you don't understand the problem which this represents in particular, you don't understand how to organize. And many of us are concerned about this problem of how to organize. Now, most of us who are senior in organizing come from the oldest of these generations. And Amelia counts herself as part of it. That's the World War II generation. With those of us who lived through the 20s, some a bit earlier as well, through the 1930s Depression, through the war years, through the post-war years, immediate post-war years. And we have a different experience than anyone else living in the United States today. It was our generation which was involved in leadership of the events of the 1960s. It was our generation which was represented in government in the 1960s, as typified by the case of President Kennedy. Now, we have a way of thinking and doing things, even with our differences in our generation, which is far different than the people in the generation that came after us, which is President Clinton's generation. That is the generation which is running Washington today and running most institutions, or more and more of them today, is President Clinton's generation, the baby boomers. Then we have a 3rd generation, which we call Generation X. I don't know if it's because they watch X-rated movies or what, but it's called Generation X. They're very poorly educated. They have been exposed to nothing but lies in most of their life. They're not necessarily bad, they're not mean-spirited people necessarily. They just don't know. And what they believe they know is what they've been told, and what they've been told is mostly nonsense, falsehood. What they've been told they will get an A grade for in school is nonsense. And therefore, the better grades they've got, the worse off you are in dealing with them sometimes. Because they're highly opinionated. You know, I often say in jokes about them, I say, how do you pick out Generation X from a crowd? He's the kid that comes to school to hockey practice wearing skis, and then criticizing everybody else for being wrong. But these 3 generations think differently. Not that they should think differently, but the experience of our generation and of generations before ours has not been communicated efficiently to people of the President's generation or the people of Generation X especially. So therefore, we run into a crisis in which the majority of the adult population of the United States, overwhelming majority, is composed of baby boomers and Generation X. And what you say to me and what you say among yourselves is, given this reality, how do we organize what must be done when we can talk among ourselves as the World War II generation, or approximately that, we understand one another because we have a common experience in which to reference our discussion. But how do we reference reality to these younger generations of adults who are the overwhelming majority of the voting population? How do we deal with them? We see them doing foolish things. Now, many people will criticize President Clinton. And I do it, but I do it with I think a little more insight than most do. Because some people are quick to criticize without realizing what they are criticizing and what they're not criticizing. What they should be criticizing in President Clinton is that he is a representative of his generation, of the baby boomers. And the generation as a whole is non-functional. I would not have wished to fought World War II under a government run by baby boomers. We'd have lost the war because they are not performance-oriented. You know what let's go through this. And I'm going to go through two experiences of reference and then get to my point, concluding point, which is about the Hamlet problem, which I think are the key points to look at in discussing the problem of how do we organize our fellow citizens to do what is necessary under these conditions and with this generational problem. Right. We lived through World War II. And what that means is that we lived in the silly years of the 1920s. And in the 1920s, most Americans were silly. It's the fairest and kindest thing you can say about them. Okay. Then we got hit with the Great Depression. And now remember, up to that time, let's be frank about the Democratic Party too, because you've got to tell the truth. You can't lie. During the 19th century, the party of patriotism was not the party of Jefferson and Jackson by a long shot. The party of patriotism was the party of Henry Clay, first of all. It was the party of the war hawks, who were not soft on the British. It was the party, in the sense, of James Monroe. It was the party of John Quincy Adams. It was the Whigs. Then the Whigs split on the question of how to deal with the slavery question. And you had the Southern Whigs, and you had the Northern Whigs. And out of this came a new party called the Republican Party, which was formed in the middle of the 1950s after one of the most treasonous lunatics that ever occupied the presidency, Franklin Pierce, the reputed ancestor of Barbara Pierce Bush, or she claimed it at one point, who was followed by one of the worst traitors in American history, James Buchanan. But in this process, Lincoln established the Republican Party as the party of patriotism, in the tradition of the founders, but with a new dimension. Lincoln was probably the greatest president this nation has ever had, though he's much understated. If one has read what he actually wrote, know how he governed, and look at the policies and circumstances in which those policies were conducted, and know what he was up against and what he understood he was up against, he stands out as probably the greatest president, the man of the greatest intellectual development among all presidents we've had in the United States so far. So during the 19th century, except for Massachusetts, New England, the New York crowd, the Republican Party was the party of the patriots from Lincoln on. Then that changed. In 1901, some admirers of Teddy Roosevelt from Britain arranged to have the President of the United States, McKinley, assassinated in order to bring to power Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was the nephew of James Bullock. And Bullock was the leading Confederate organizer in London during the Civil War. It was that whole Atlanta crowd, the Bullock that gave you later Coca-Cola, the same crowd, Teddy Roosevelt's crowd. Coca-Cola, cheap kind of mud and drink. You can make it for a fraction of a penny, and you can sell it for a nickel, right? And you can set up a political machine by putting people up in Coca-Cola franchises, which is why you set somebody up to make a little money, to have some slush fund in his community, and finance a whole organization. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was essentially a traitor to the United States. He was a true Confederate. Then we got past that, and we went through a guy from Ohio called Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt helped to put into power a guy from Virginia who was a great admirer of the Ku Klux Klan. His name was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, from the White House, launched the reorganization and rebuilding of the Ku Klux Klan in America. That's the Klan of the World War I, 1920s, early 1930s period. It was organized around a film called The Klansman, which was renamed The Birth of a Nation, produced by Goldwyn and Mayer, which is the foundation of modern Hollywood. So that as we went into the World War I and the 1920s, we didn't have a patriotic party in the United States. We had two parties of treason, Republican and Democratic. Party of treason typified by Coolidge, probably one of the worst presidents we ever had, the most evil. And he was not silent Cal. He talked a lot. He was just smart enough to keep his mouth shut in public, because what he said was not doing much good if it was quoted. Along came Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was typical of executives, people who get elected, was not the best. He had many things wrong with him. Look, frankly, Roosevelt, at the time he became president, was an admirer of Benito Mussolini. Remember the NIRA when it was first formed? That was really based on Italian fascist model corporatism as a recovery model for the United States. But of course, John Dewey was an admirer of Benito Mussolini. Winston Churchill continued to be Benito Mussolini's supporters through 1938, publicly. You know, Mussolini almost got his job through Winston Churchill. Not quite that way, but it's close to it at times. But Roosevelt knew American tradition, and he was in his own way a patriot. And he underwent a change, and the change became conspicuous about 1935 with the beginning of the Committee for Industrial Organizing under John L. Lewis, which was supported by President Roosevelt. And from 1936 to 1940, there was a change in the policy of the Democratic Party and its character, and a completion of that process under Roosevelt from 1939-1940 on. So Roosevelt, in a time of crisis, took the function of leadership and responded not to some inner genius which was driving him, but he responded to the challenge of leadership being the President of the United States. And you saw that at that period, under these historic circumstances, the African American vote moved from the Republican Party, where it had been since Lincoln, to the Democratic Party. For that reason, for a good reason. Then at the end of the war, or to interpolate our experience in that period, 1939, 1943 in particular, Roosevelt used the challenge of war as a way of introducing into the United States a national economic recovery. That's how parity got back into the business and farming, because they needed it to fight a war. We had to feed ourselves and had to feed the world. We rebuilt the U.S. economy within 4 years from a junk heap into the most powerful agro-industrial machine on this planet. In 4 years, with 17 million of us in uniform. Increasing numbers of us overseas, as many of you remember. It was done by women and others working here, sometimes 2 shifts, to keep the machine going. And within 4 years, we had exceeded all production targets for the U.S. economy. That was a great achievement because if you remember the faces of the people in the 1930s, Depression, their faces had turned gray, as happens to people who had skills or who had science degrees, professional degrees, who couldn't find employment, especially not employment in their profession. People who were debt-ridden, people working for the WPA or something similar for $12, $14 a week, $16 a week was considered riches, privilege in those days. Yeah? Gray-faced, hopeless, frightened. You know, there was a cafeteria in the city I was living at the time, in Lynn, Massachusetts. It was called Hunt's. It had one of these black glass fronts, which helped make it look fancy. It was about a block and a half long in a peculiar block called Central Square in Lynn. It was just a cheap cafeteria. But you'd have people who had not eaten that day leaning against that black glass wall of that cafeteria in Central Square, which is sort of a central gathering place for the city of 102,000 people, picking their teeth with a toothpick to suggest that they had eaten that day, which is indicative of the mentality of the Depression in the United States, which you find some of that around today in various parts. People pretending not to be poor, pretending not to be destitute and desperate. Pride mixed with false pride. And suddenly we were taken out of that. I was in the training cadre in Texas as part of the war, down receiving recruits from all over the country, which is where I first got to know Bubba, if you know what I mean. I also got to know what certain people from Georgia are like, so I understood certain parts of our history later on. Also from the scrapings of Brooklyn, every part of the United States, a great melting pot which is called the Induction and Training Service, basic training and military service during the years of from 1940, when the Austin Wadsworth bill was in full effect, draft, through the end of the war. I saw overseas, as many of my friends did. I saw the conditions of life overseas. I saw the British Empire in action. And as we didn't know, Roosevelt was saying the same thing at the time. But we knew, by seeing that this is something that could not be tolerated. We could not, after isolationism going into a world war, go back home and forget about what we'd seen in India or Burma, and from my experience, for example. You could not leave the most populous part of the world under those conditions of the British Empire rule and not think that we were going to be called to war or some other kind of conflict that would reach us down the line in generations to come. We knew the British, Dutch, and French Empire had to be eliminated. And I can say on personal knowledge from what I knew overseas and on the boats coming home in 1946, that we, the majority of us, believe that must be done, that the United States must use its power to destroy the British, French, and Dutch empires around the world, to give freedom to the people in these colonial countries, and to play a role in the economic development of countries which desperately needed the right to their own autonomous economic development. We came home. Then I saw some of these people with whom I'd served. They had changed. They no longer believed. Maybe they believed underneath. Or they would say to me, yes, yes, I agreed. I know that. But. Then they look around to the wife in the kitchen. What had happened is that Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after Roosevelt's death, was not of the Roosevelt Democratic Party, but was a product of the party which ran closer to Woodrow Wilson. That Truman was totally controlled by Averell Harriman, which is why the 2 bombs were dropped on Japan. Totally unnecessary bombing of Japan with those weapons. Japan was going to surrender. The surrender had already been negotiated. It was done for different reasons. Truman also put the United States unnecessarily under British orders and Harriman guidance into an artificial depression, which some of you remember. You came back and they shut down the economy. Said the war is over, we're going to shut down the economy, 1945-46. And from 45-46, the returning veteran came back to the United States, which had been put back into what looked to us like a depression. And that continued until 1949. What happened to us, my generation, is we became a bunch of stinking cowards. Not me. I'm a nasty fellow. I don't do those things. But I would see them, and they would look like this. What do we talk about? What do we talk about? Don't say anything that will get me into trouble, or my wife will have you thrown out of the house. I've got to think about my career, my job. I've got a baby coming. I got to be careful. McCarthyism did not start with Joe McCarthy, the lunatic, I used to call him the Appleton ape. He didn't start it. Truman started it. The Truman era started it. Of Americans who had fought in a war who came back with and lost their courage on the streets of the United States for fear of economic security, who would turn against their neighbors and friends and even family members to try to save their own career, to avoid embarrassment. But these fellow veterans of mine produced children. And some of them became reasonably successful, but they didn't give their children much morality. They were quicker to give the child a toy than morality. The child was watching the television set. I want a toy. The child put on a tantrum. The latest toy would be produced in these typical middle-class families in suburbia. And then the time came that these pretty little children, whose parents had lost courage and didn't have too much morality left, these were people who generally would support the civil rights movement when the time came, but they didn't have much strength when it came to a fight themselves. They had sympathies, they had guilty consciences, but not much fight. And their pretty little children from suburbia went to schools. And the wealthier ones generally got into university, where they were going to advance their career. They were going to become rich suburbanites. They weren't going to have to get their hands dirty in a factory. They would have a professional employment after a university education. They weren't concerned too much about dedication to a vocation, but rather dedication to a career, a professional career. You know, the difference between a person who's dedicated to something because they want to do it, they believe in it, and they'll do it at any price because that's their identity, as opposed to somebody who says, I decided the best way for me to get rich is to do this, or to have the right kind of life. And that's what they became. And all was quiet and well until October of 1962, when some Soviet ships, which we watched on television every night, there was to be a showing of these Soviet ships during a week or so, going toward Cuba. And we were told that those Soviet ships had medium-range missiles fit for nuclear warheads, which presumably also might be on those ships. And the United States said, no, those ships will turn back. We saw an American fleet, including a naval ship called the Joe Kennedy, out there in the Caribbean, waiting to intercept those Soviet ships. And people who hadn't known what a church was suddenly went to the nearest one to pray, give confession, and so forth, because they were convinced that it was about to end, all of it. The whole nation went for about a week or so into a thermonuclear shock. The end was not nigh, it was virtually here, and they could look up in the sky and expect to see it coming. Now that was something that happened to those children. Then 13 months later, the President of the United States, Kennedy, was assassinated. And nothing was done about it, except to take some patsy who had nothing to do with the crime and shoot him, and then pronounce the thing covered up. It happens that Lee Harvey Oswald had sent a telegram about 48 hours. Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way, was a government agent. It was actually an agent working for the FBI at the time, who had sent a cable to J. Edgar Hoover because he'd been blocked on the Dallas office level, tipping off J. Edgar Hoover to announce that there is a high-level assassination imminently planned against the president in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. J. Edgar Hoover did nothing about that telegram. Matter of fact, he hid it a little later, but later was discovered. Nothing was done. Then the Warren Commission shocked people because they saw the Warren Commission was a transparent fraud. Nobody who's any sense could actually believe the Warren Commission report. It just was stunk all over the surface. It's like a comic book story that doesn't wash, only this wasn't funny. Then, a little later, we had some more assassinations. We had the attempted assassination of de Gaulle by the same people who actually killed Kennedy, which is British intelligence, an organization tied to the Bronfmans in Canada, headed by a fellow called Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, headed up an organization called Permanent Industrial Exposition, which is the organization which was indicted in New Orleans, headed by Clay Shaw, who was a former OSS officer who had worked under the direction of the head of Permindex during World War II. And it was Permindex which had tried to assassinate de Gaulle, the same organization that killed Kennedy. But nobody would talk about it because that's British intelligence. A little bit later, Malcolm X. Malcolm X, there was a lot of confusion about that, but there was a spray of blood that said, no, this should not have happened. This is political. And the dirty finger, the bloody finger, pointed to the FBI. Then April 1968, Martin is killed. FBI. FBI, the same crowd. Remember that Louis Mortimer Bloomfield was in 1963, still from 1938 to 1963, was British intelligence personnel advisor to J. Edgar Hoover for Division 5 of the FBI. And he was the assassin. Then, a few weeks later, after Martin, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. All of these assassinations occurred in the context of what became known as the Vietnam War. In 1963, Kennedy had written an executive order, or had ordered McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, to write the order, and he signed it, instructing the United States under executive order that the United States military forces would be out of Indochina by 1965, and a process of withdrawal would begin then, with that terminal date. As a matter of fact, the president was smart. He got Robert Strange McNamara, who was then the defense secretary, right on the steps of the White House where he could watch him, and forced him to hold a press conference on the White House steps announcing that that executive order had been issued and the Defense Department would now proceed to prepare for the total withdrawal of U.S. forces, military forces, from Vietnam by 1965. We all knew that, remember? We remembered the president had assured us there would be no involvement in a war in Vietnam, and that the troops would begin to be withdrawn from there to prevent that contingency from being pursued. And the president's dead. The war began. And McGeorge Bundy, who had prepared an order contrary to Kennedy's, while Kennedy was still alive, got Johnson to sign the order. Why? Because Johnson, as Johnson said a number of times, he believed that there was a high-level hit squad. No, Lee Harvey Oswald had killed Kennedy. And he thought the guns were aimed at him, too, if he got out of line. So he signed the order. And Goldwater talked about that in his presidential campaign of 1964. And he was right. Johnson had signed the order. We were going to war in Vietnam. Now that also came out, 1964-65. About that time, McGeorge Bundy, having gotten Johnson into the war in Vietnam, resigned as National Security Advisor and went to work for the Ford Foundation, where McGeorge Bundy organized the funding of the anti-war movement. So in this process, with the nightly television showing the potential draftee on college campus pictures of the slaughter in Indochina, particularly Vietnam, showing American bodies being displayed on the television screen as well as Vietnamese every night, took this bunch of cowardly youth, college youth, who've been trained in cowardice by my generation, to develop a streak of cowardice. Under this condition, these children of my generation were systematically destroyed in large degree. First of all, they'd had these shocks. Thermonuclear war, shock. President killed, shock. Malcolm X killed, minor shock but significant. Malcolm killed, major shock. Bobby Kennedy killed, shock. Vietnam War, ongoing shock. And what did they do to them? Well, they told them, don't blame us. Blame science. Science created the nuclear weapon. Blame science. Don't blame McGeorge Bundy. Blame science. They created weapons, modern weapons. Don't you see, if we eliminate science and modern weapons, we won't have a problem. What we have to do is eliminate war. You say, what about the war makers? No, war is the danger. The military is the danger. It's not the president, it's not the establishment that does these things. So we had the introduction of several things. First of all, on fear. You're frightened? Well, you have to clear your head. You know, your head problem. You have to do something about that head of yours. What? LSD 25. And if we do between LSD 25 doses, why don't you try a little bit? You know, if you take marijuana and if you drink it with a lot of wine, cheap wine, Gallo Brothers perhaps, that the combined effect of drinking a lot of alcoholic beverage and taking marijuana, you will have a much effect. Particularly, you'll have recalls which are induced by having a little LSD once in a while. And you'll find that the anti-war movement, or the extreme radical wing of it, in 1967, 68, 69, was producing the Weathermen out of this syndrome, the Weatherman bombers, which actually the Weatherman was created by a funding operation of McGeorge Bundy at the Ford Foundation. Okay, drugs aren't enough? Well, try a little sex. With whom? Well, with anybody. What if that's not enough? Well, anything. You divert, fix your head. A combination. Oh, you still keep thinking about the war? You still keep thinking about those images? You're worried about the draft? You can't stand the world? Go to an all-night rock concert. Boom, 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 boom. You won't do any thinking. And then if you mix it with a little sex and a little drugs, fine. Right? So then with that, in 1966, 68, we produced by 69 a big drug generation among college baby boomer youth. Now, this includes the generation of the president and his friends. Now, I don't think he was very much into this drug and so forth stuff. But you know, you never know about Bubba, right, on the other stuff, huh? when it comes to sex. But nonetheless, that's part of the experience. Then, what happened? The drug usage spread to the younger brothers and sisters and others of the college students, the high schools. That's the end of the decade and the beginning of the 1970s. Very rapidly, in the early 1970s, those drugs began showing up around the grammar schools, which produced the drug culture, the drug subculture of the United States. So you had post-industrial society, industry, agriculture, they're no good, they're all evil. And you had this drug culture. Then you had, beginning 1970, or organized in 1969, the so-called ecology movement. The ecology movement is based on the assumption man is bad, animals are good. Become an animal, right? Which is what they pretty much did. So that we have, as a result of these changes in policy, plus the introduction of the so-called floating exchange rate system at monetary policy, we have had a decline from a society which, through all of its existence, had at least as a secular tendency with some vacations, a commitment from the beginning of this republic to the promotion of scientific and technological progress in agriculture, industry, and infrastructure, and to universal education adapted to that kind of society as the policy of the nation. Right? And suddenly in 1966 or thereabouts, a turning point occurred. Rock, drug, sex, counterculture, instead of educating the head, mind, destroy it. Number two, go from industrial society to services economy, the so-called information society. Number three, instead of having relations with other countries based on trade to promote international technology and development, we don't want that. We have now a floating exchange rate monetary system. Speculation is the game. Then we had ecology. We've got to get rid of industry. We've got to get rid of the standard of living. We've got to live more simply. We've got to go without this. We've got to go without that, all for the sake of Mother Nature. Right? And thus, what happened to our economy is that over the period from 1966 to 1970, although we were still making some progress, such as this moon space landing, manned moon landing was part of that, it was on the inertia of what we'd started before. But investments in infrastructure began to decline. Scientific progress and technological progress began to decline. In 1970, we were no longer maintaining the infrastructure we had previously developed. From 1970 on, 1970, 71, there has been a progressive decline in the U.S. economy in terms of consumption per capita. That is, the following things: physical facts. Let's take several categories of consumption. You have household consumption, obviously. You also have consumption you require infrastructure, such as clean water to drink, sanitation, transportation, power systems, so forth. You also have agriculture, investment in agriculture in order to have the food produced. You have to have investment and the cost of maintaining investment in manufacturing to produce the products. In other industry, you must have investment in the process to produce the products. You must also have three categories of services which are essential to productivity in life. Obviously, healthcare. And I'll take the case of Alabama. Let's take a very simple problem, which has been characteristic of the state of Alabama for a long time. Let's take a case in the test case in every part of Alabama. It's a simple test. It's called the birth crisis test. Take a woman who's pregnant, who's got herself in a birth complication, who requires hospital care. And there's a lapsed time within which she must get to a hospital, because otherwise the likelihood of successful treatment is lost. Either you're going to lose the baby or you're going to lose the mother, or both. What's your chance of getting that woman in a birth crisis to a hospital in time in the state of Alabama? Let's take the whole state of Alabama, and let's take every locality in Alabama. Let's make a map of the places in Alabama from which you can get that woman to a hospital that will receive her, regardless of what her credit card is, and time. Right? Now let's take the opposite. Let's take the areas of Alabama which don't have that possibility. Let's count the numbers. Right? A simple test, isn't it? Now let's look at it, that problem, at various dates. Let's start from the passage of the Hill-Burton legislation in the 1940s, which mandated cooperation among various public and private agencies to produce hospital facilities which were adequate for every community in the United States to serve the entire population. And let's look at what the state of Alabama looked like in terms of handling that birth crisis case in time over each of those years from 1950 to the present. You'll find there is a slight, slow, stubborn improvement. Not enough, never enough. Then you get to a point, you get a maximum point of health care availability in terms of hospital facilities by that standard in the state of Alabama. Then it begins to go down. Just think of the lost hospitals and the lost facilities, or think of facilities you can't get into if you don't have the right credit card or the right HMO program. Right? So therefore, this is, you can measure something here very simply. Do you have it or don't you? Now let's take all other kinds of diseases and do the same thing. What's your chance, if you have this problem, of getting the treatment you require in time? And not being told, take an aspirin and go home and see if the cancer goes away. Which is what it's getting to with HMOs today. Now let's take another thing, education. What does it take to provide the kind of education which can produce a labor force, which can produce what a society requires, which is able to put a man on the moon. That is, what is the level of education which the total population must have to give you the kind of society which has the technological and productive capability of maintaining itself while also putting a man on the moon? That's a known problem. So let's assure today that everybody in the United States, today or back in 1970, that everybody in the United States should have the kind of education which they should have in order to maintain a total society which, among its other tasks, would be capable of putting a man on the moon. Because we did that, and therefore we can measure what that took. What kind of education should we have had to be able to do that kind of thing? Now, we obviously should not have had cable leading to television in the classroom, which is where one of the places where the president makes a mistake, and that's a generation, baby boomer generation problem. He doesn't understand what education is. Plainly, the president honestly, sincerely does not understand what education is, even though he had a fairly good one. It's typical because they believe in this information age. What you require is you require a situation in which every human being is a repository of the important discoveries, original discoveries, which are made by mankind in all previous history. Going back, say, the ancient Greeks, going back to questions of the early development of astronomy, which goes back tens of thousands of years, which we have some trace, and so forth. So a child should be able to, in the process of education, should be able to demonstrate that discovery, not learn it, not learn to write the right answer down on a test, but should be able to say, okay, kiddo, we're going to have a test today. It's your examination. We didn't see the examination papers, teacher. Don't pull that swindle on me. You're going to be really tested. I'll give you an example, the kind of question which you would ask, say, in a good school of someone, say, in the 10th grade. And say, all right, in the 3rd century BC, the chief librarian of the Library at Alexandria, Egypt, estimated the size of the meridian of Earth. He came within 50 miles accuracy of the estimate of the size of the pole. Note that no man until the 20th century had ever seen the curvature of the Earth with their own eyes until we got some things out in space. Tell us, how did Eratosthenes know that the Earth had curvature? How did he prove it? And how did he measure it? Now, in my system of education, any child in the 10th grade could easily answer that question. In other words, we don't want the child to know the right answer or where to look it up in the book. We want the child to have gone through the experience of reliving the experience of great discoveries. For example, how did the man first estimate the distance from the moon to the Earth? In the same time. Wasn't a very good estimate, but was a good approach to estimating. Right? How was the distance to the Earth and moon measured in the time of Plato and 100, 200 years after him? How was that measured? Any child in the 10th grade can do that if they're properly educated. Every important discovery of principle on which modern science is based and modern art, that is, classical art forms, are based, music and the rest, is a principle which a child can learn by reliving the experiment. So therefore, we want a teacher who can lead a class of not more than 15 or 16 pupils per class in order to get interaction among the students, which is essential for this process, to put the class through the process of learning to think about the world in that way. So no longer is there mystery or double talk or so forth, but you've developed a person who has a rounded capability and has a sense of a connection to people thousands of years before. Because what's the big question? Let's take a little time out here. Just what's the big question you have to get forward in people's mind? Now, in my writings, you'll often run across two biblical references, which I'm constantly dealing with, and references to this in other forms. One, Genesis 1, 26, 30, that man is made in the image of God, and that man is made in the image of God to have dominion over the universe, over creation. Now, what is that? What's Genesis talking about? What's Moses telling us in Genesis 1? What is the quality by which man demonstrates dominion over the earth? And man does. Because if man were a higher ape, as Prince Philip of England claims to be, then there would only be 3 million of them, at most. At any time in the past 2 million years, this planet could not have supported more than 3 million monkeys like Prince Philip on this planet at any one time. And that's already too many. But in any case. But man had a population in the time of Europe's 14th century of 300 million people. That's a lot more than 3 million. Today we have 5.2 or more people on this planet. The life expectancy up until 1966 of mankind had increased. The quality of health, the rate of childbirth mortality and infant mortality had decreased. We were conquering diseases. The quality of life and standard of living of people around the world, despite all the problems, was improving. How do we do that? Isn't that what Moses is telling us through Genesis 1, 26 through 30? That man has a capability to do, as Genesis 1 says, to exert dominion over this planet. How do we do that? By discoveries. Only the mind of the human individual can make valid discoveries of principle, that is, laws of nature, principles of nature, by which man, by obeying these discoveries, can increase man's power over nature, i.e., dominion in the universe. And what is that power? The power of discovery. How do we transmit it? Well, every child has it. Every child has it. You can look between the eyes of any child, newborn, it's there. Just look behind the eyes. Unless it's certain kinds of people like Trent Lawton, there's nothing there, except an advisor telling him how to cheat. But in any case, has it. So that's what the game is, isn't it? The first part of the whole game of humanity is to recognize that every human being has this divine gift, this potential for creative reason. That this creative reason involves what we should consider the goals of education, to transmit to every child the most important of these discoveries which mankind has made, which are transmitted up to us and are gift to us from the talent of the past. And that child becomes a repository of all humanity has achieved, at least in principle. Therefore, there's a moral aspect to this in the sense that the child now knows that he or she has a direct connection to people long since dead. Their minds have lived. When you relive a discovery, which you validate, you have relived the experience that occurred in the mind of an Archimedes or Aristophanes and so forth thousands of years before. You have relived their mind. The same thing is in a great work of art. When you really have understood a great work of art, which is done on the same principle as a scientific discovery, you have relived a beautiful moment, creative moment from the artist who composed the work of art. That is education. Now, if there's another principle, which I keep referring to, it involves a Greek word called agape. Agape first appears in this usage in the writings of Plato, and it occurs beginning the second book of the Republic, and then turns up again repeatedly in later plays, later dialogues, which means love. Plato uses it to identify love of truth, love of justice, love of God, love of mankind. Agape. The next place after Plato that you find this, except among Plato's friends, you find this is in the New Testament. You find this in the Gospel of John. God so loved the world. That the word is agape. You find this in 1 Corinthians 13, which is referred to in the King James Version, translated as charity, which is this quality of love of truth, love of mankind, love of God, love of justice. Well, therefore, this relationship between people long dead in terms of ideas, the power and its added dominion over nature we have because we honor our connection to them by reliving the great moments of their mental life in our own mind, which becomes our power. We can transmit this to our children. We can do the same thing they did and participate in making discoveries, share making discoveries, which we pass along to people after us. And as is the New Testament, the parable of the talent. We are given a talent. We are born with a talent, a creative power, and a span of life. We don't know how long that span is going to be, but we've got a span of life. Now, if during this time we use that talent, that creative power, to do good, to honor the good that was done before us, to assimilate what is given to us from the past, to honor that good, to use that good, to transmit it to others, and to try to improve upon it by adding something to it, then we can die with a smile on our face because we know we have fulfilled our talent. We say, I'm returning my talent, Master. I have used it and I have increased it. I have done as you commanded me. Right? That's what the whole game is about. The game is to bring all people into this fold of being treated as in the image of God. To do that means that you have to provide them the opportunity to live so. That society's function is to give the protection to the weak, mortal individual to from birth have the opportunity to become this kind of person, which is their potentiality, their divine gift of potentiality. That requires that we nurture their bodies, requires that we educate them, it requires that we seek to provide the means by which their talent can be expressed to the benefit of mankind. So they can have the right to go to their grave saying, I'm proud of having lived because I have fulfilled my talent and returned it enriched to he who gave it to me. That's the name of the game. So that's what economics is. That's the reality of economics. It is not some mystical, dry, dead thing. And by that standard, the requirements of housing, the requirements of health care, the requirements of education, the requirements of clean water for the community, the requirements of transportation, the requirements of power for production. These things are necessities which we can measure, at least we can measure how much minimally must be provided to maintain mankind in its present condition or to improve it. And by that standard, by counting the things you have to count to do that, we have been shrinking as a nation by more than 2% per year for the past 25 years. There never was any growth under any president since 1970. None. And you can see it in the streets. You can see it in the communities. You can see it in the unemployment. You can see it in the people who are out working and their children are latchkey children because you can't run a family based on a good provider anymore. Both adults must work. You can see it in broken marriages with single parents where the conditions produced on the child of not having adequate nurture because somebody must struggle just to try to barely meet the standard of existence of the household. And there is no time or energy left for nurture of the children. There's no one to be there when the child wants to share something. And you know how it is. You've all been parents and grandparents. You know what this is. The most important thing for the child is this sharing of some moment of beauty in their own experience where they can talk about it, where they can interact with older people, where they can get a sense of identity, a sense that they're part of the continuity. Are you proud of me? Not because I look pretty, but because I can think. because I can think beautiful things, because I'm learning to make beautiful things. Am I going in the right direction? And we have created a society where this kind of nurture is denied by physical circumstances. People who accept that, who accept the assumptions, as most people do, as many people in Clinton's generation do, the assumptions that the values of the anti-war youth of the 1960s and the so-called liberal values of that period, in the early 1970s, that these values, environmentalism, post-industrial society, information society, wired classrooms with television sets instead of teachers, that these are goods. That it's good to have global economy. It is good to do this. It is good to do that. Let's have a dialogue. Let's have a sensitivity group and decide what words we will use to describe each other. I'm not a woman, I'm a Ms. Which is a woman saying, I'm a victim and I'm nothing. I have to be artificially propped up. I don't have real dignity. Dignity lies in the mind. Any woman can do what any man can do with a mind. Perfectly equality on that level. You just have to have the opportunity to do that and be recognized for that. And everything else works out fine. And we all know women, particularly in the movement, who have shown themselves outstanding leaders. They don't need any special gimmicks, sensitivity gimmicks. They've earned their way. They've proven. But these people, the sensitivity, you have to use the right words. All these kinds of things. They don't go by performance. We go by performance in our generation. Is the food on the table? Is there time for the family? Is there time for the children? Are the schools real? Then you have Generation X. Generation X are the people who were the victims of what happened to the baby boomer generation. They don't have schools. We don't have media that deal in ideas anymore, deal in slogans, impressions. We have a generation that's looking for entertainment. We have a generation that's living in virtual reality. The television set is virtual reality. They don't see reality. They see what they see on the television set. There's no reality there. So that's our problem. Now, how do we deal with it? The only way I know how to deal with it, and I find that speaking around the country and getting into these question periods helps to make it clearer. You have to recognize that we have the three generations. We have to look back in history and understand generations before our time, generations dead, generations some of us who are older knew, because we knew our grandfathers, some our great-grandparents. And we were able to construct, if we think about it, knowing something about history in those periods, we're able to reconstruct in our own mind what kind of a world, how do they see the world? What was their experience? And if we're good at that, we can go back, I can go back to my oldest person that was a dinner table person, that is dinner table conversation person who influenced, was a guy who was born the year Lincoln was born. He was born in North Carolina, and Carolinas, and got run out of there because he was an abolitionist, went up to Ohio. And he was kind of influential, out there. But we can reconstruct in our own families. We're talking tonight with probably people still alive who have, in that sense, can trace back to slavery times, in terms of the inside experience of slavery, where there's some knowledge in the family of what it was like under slavery in that family, even what the experience was to some degree. So we can go back, and when looking at the world as a whole, in a longer period of time, from the same mentality, we can understand history in a more general way. We can see that people in different generations, different cultures, have thought differently. And it's not that they're all equally correct. Most of them are wrong. But it's not a question of who has the right answer. It's a question of who's able to improve and correct the mistakes that they inherit. It's like scientific progress, which is based on correcting mistaken assumptions which we had beforehand. And if our parents were wrong and we're able to correct their errors, that doesn't put them down, because they made it possible for us to correct their errors. And we would hope that our followers would do the same for us. So what we have to do is create that sense in this population, among the three generations, that this problem does exist, a problem which we can master and understand. We have to say, Well, of the assumptions about 3 generations, which assumptions were correct and which were incorrect? It's not a question of sensitivity group. Were you right to bring about, to support policies which have destroyed this society over the past 25 years? Were you right to do this? Were you right to do, what was the stupidity of us, our generation? And I find that's quite effective. I go into Russia. I was in there several weeks ago. I was speaking at a seminar in the last 3rd week of April. All-day seminar in Moscow with a group of scientific institutions in discussing these matters. And then in the evening, a couple of days later, at the university outside in part of Moscow, but a bunch of scientists and others, I discussed this question of generational business. And I compared for them the generational problem here in the United States with what I knew of their generational differences there in Russia, from their experience over the same period of time. They have the same problem. A different problem, but the same form of problem. We have to get away from speaking at one another in the indicative mood. We have to get under one another's skins. We have to make ourselves and others conscious of the assumptions we take for granted, which, like axioms of geometry, control the way we think, control the way we form opinions. We have to take people from Generation X. I had some experience here in Alabama. Was speaking with some young journalists, for example, who are Generation X people. And in trying to get to see what they were thinking, I get a better picture of what was going on inside their mind. Not in terms of what they were saying, but what was causing them to say what they were saying. Why couldn't they understand something which seemed very simple? They couldn't understand it because it ran against something they assumed to be true arbitrarily. And you get the thing, they say, but are you saying that what we believe is not true? And then the real thing would pop out. Huh? So that what we have to do is, instead of talking at members of the 3 generations, we have to do, in a sense, what I've been trying to describe here tonight. We have to bring forth the discussion in terms of reference to the differences in his experience among us, and then think of history in a larger sense as part of the same thing. Now let me complete this with one general observation on President Clinton himself. Taking all this into account. President Clinton, President Bubba Hamlet Clinton. Okay? And you can be generous about that. You know what that is. Because Bubba is his problem. I mean, it's a problem to be Bubba. Because you're imprisoned in certain assumptions about the way you must behave and about what you must appear to be, and you will often act to generate that appearance, that particular type of macho or whatever, a Bubba, and you are not acting in your interest, you're acting in the interest of behaving like Bubba. Because that's what's expected of you. At least it's some very funny and sometimes not funny results. He's Hamlet is the problem. Now what's Hamlet? Hamlet's the typical of this type of problem. Hamlet is portrayed by Shakespeare as really a great tragic figure, which doesn't mean it's good. It means it's great because it's profound and has implications from which we can learn in many situations today, United States today. Just think about Hamlet. Now Hamlet is a jock. He's a Bubba. He kills people. That's his profession. Jim Bevel will tell you about that. He kills people. He has a sword. And there's somebody behind the curtain. He doesn't even wait to find out who it is. He's got that sword going through the curtain right in front of his mother, and he's killing somebody, which he thinks is a stepfather, actually, suspects, but it's not. It's Polonius. And what was he doing? Well, he's out there killing people in war. He's always coming in from wars of killing people, or going out in wars to killing people. And how does he die? Killing people. Killing and being killed. Huh? So he's not a softie. He's a macho. A real killer macho. Swinging that sword, knocking off heads, bringing intestines into full display. that kind of stuff. So it's not a lack of physical courage on Hamlet's part. It's a lack of intellectual courage, of moral courage. What did he say? He tells you that in the third act, the famous soliloquy in the third act of the play. To be or not to be. It's in the subjunctive. To be this or to be that. The choice is, and he says, what I dare not be, which puzzles me, I think of as like death. A bourne from which no traveler has returned. And I would rather bear the ills I have than those I know not of. Huh? In other words, Bubba is the kind of soldier who we used to call a jarhead. You know, there's a joke about the Marine jarhead, the Marine colonel. Not as a kind of a bloody joke, I suppose. But he's told to take a position after every other person who's tried to take the position has failed. So he throws his whole regiment into the assault, and they're almost wiped out, but they take the position. And someone asked the colonel afterward, why didn't you flank him? And he goes, jarhead. Now, that's Hamlet. It's saying that he has a problem to solve, that he knows that if he goes the way he's going, he's doomed. And yet he says, I would rather be doomed to die in this way and fail than think about winning by taking a course of action of which I know, but which is unfamiliar to me. The person who says, I don't care what the truth is, down here, we have our way of doing things. You ever hear that? Huh? Don't tell me, I know it may not work, but that's the way we do things down here. Well. And that's Hamlet's problem. That's Bubba's problem. That's Bubba Clinton's problem. Look, he's been told that what he has to do is to play up to Generation X, that is to adopt and be prominently attached to themes which are popular issues of perception among representatives of Generation X. He's told that if he can recruit Generation X on the basis of reflex, knee-jerk reaction to his espousing these themes, that he will get the unknown vote from Generation X into the polls to vote for him, that he can already count on having, without any work, the African-American vote, the Hispanic vote, the labor vote, the retired people vote. And that what he has to do, since these votes can't go anyplace else, they're prisoners of the Democratic Party. All he has to do is win over Generation X and similar people. Huh? Now, this means that he has agreed with a group of people, some of whom he knows to be his enemies, some of whom he knows are not friends of him as best. And he's come to an agreement with people like Dick Morris, the former advisor to Trent Lott, who's still intimate with Trent Lott, right? To run a certain kind of campaign. And he's been told by Don Fowler and others to distance himself from the congressional campaigns. Now, what's going on there? As you know, as organizers or people who are engaged in organizing, professionals with experience, that in this state, as every other state, the issue, the gut issue of the majority of the people is economic. Not simple economics, but everything you want to do costs money, whether it's education, health care, anything else, everything that's important, there's a financial cost attached to it. And we are losing what we have because the tax revenue base of federal, state, and local government is collapsing, county government, municipal government, it's collapsing. That it's getting worse and worse, and there's no money to pay to maintain what is essential. And it's not a matter of budgetary management. The money doesn't exist. You know, it's like the fellow in the old days and said, father comes in and says, look, mother, can't we balance the budget? And said, yeah, we probably could if you could go out to work. Yeah. And what this nation has to do is exactly that. And we have to put it back to work. Otherwise, we're not going to balance the budget. And it doesn't make, otherwise balancing the budget is an exercise in futility and insanity. We have to put the nation back to work. Everyone knows that. Every politician knows that. These are the gut issues that translate into a price tag. Everyone who's running for Congress who's serious on the Democratic side knows that. I saw that down in Mobile with the New South Coalition. I saw that with Joe Reed's crowd here down in Montgomery on the Democratic conference. Same thing. As a matter of fact, we had this nice little guy from Tennessee, perfectly decent little Democrat, well-meaning guy, probably not 30, but well-meaning, good-hearted fellow, comes in, Generation X profile, huh? Comes in, young lawyer. I guess we got a lot of those, haven't we? Anyway, he came in, and he's speaking to the crowd as a courtesy guest. And he's all enthusiastic and all happy, telling these people the good news, that unemployment has collapsed in the state of Alabama. And I heard boos from that crowd right, at that point. But so everyone knows this. They're all playing to it. All right. Therefore, the Democratic Party on the state levels in running candidates for the Senate and candidates especially for the House of Representatives, which is even more sensitive, whether you win the election or not will depend on turning out the vote, and it will also depend on turning out on the basis of economic issues, directly or indirectly. Now, what happens if the candidates, if the party is dumb enough to listen to the leadership of the Democratic National Committee or to try to imitate President Clinton's program? The president said he's distancing himself from the congressional candidacies. Okay, fine. He wants to do that, fine. He's got a right to do that. But maybe some of the rest of us should not. What happens? He's elected. What happens after he's nominated? He's impeached. Because without a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, possibly we also need a majority in the Senate. Without that, I can guarantee you he will be impeached quicker than you can say Dick Nixon. They're out for him. So that here's Hamlet, Bubba Clinton, being told that the way to glory, i.e. re-election, he's got a little bit of an ego problem. Sports jock mentality, you got to win the game. You get confused between a sports tournament and real politics, you can be in trouble. Winning is not the game. Winning, the result you must get is the game, not your personal aggrandizement. Sometimes the best way to save the country is to lose the election by fighting for the principle. I've done that a number of times. Right? Say what you have to say. Say what needs to be said. And sooner or later it'll do some good. But if you lie, you're never going to do any good. If you kid yourself, you delude yourself that this is a sports contest. If you want to have a sports contest, go out in the kiddie playing field and have a sports contest. Don't bring it into politics. Here the game is real. It's not a game. It's people's lives. It's the future of this nation, the future of this planet that's at stake. But the president has got himself, Bubba, has got himself playing the game of Hamlet. He's playing the game he believes he has to play, the way things are done down here, rather than risk going to the unknown. What's he afraid of? What most of the voters are afraid of. How are the voters controlled? How are most of the politicians controlled? What do you people expect of me in this respect? What controls the nation, the way a few tens of thousands of people can control a nation of 230 million people. How's it done? Is it done with bayonets? No. Even the IRS can't do that. How's it done? By fear. How was the nation controlled in the post-war period under Truman? By its fear. How is it controlled? How are the baby boomers ruined? By fear. How is Generation X controlled? By fear. Fear of the unknown, and practically everything is unknown to them. How is the Democratic Party leadership controlled? By fear. How is every constituency in the Democratic Party controlled? By fear. We can't go with you. Do you know what the risk is? We got to play it safe. Therefore, the people with the cattle prods, by your fear of the cattle prods, cause you to act like cattle. Right? And what do you expect of me? You expect me to take the fear out of the situation, don't you? So we don't act like collectively like Hamlet. Can you deal with the president? Can we deal with ourselves? If we can take the fear out of ourselves, we can take the fear out of Bubba Clinton. If we can take back the House of Representatives, if we can turn out the vote, if we can raise the vital issues and tell the people the truth, so that when the crisis hits, they say, okay, you were right. You told us what was going to happen. It's happened. Now tell us what next to do. So that instead of the crisis terrifying them, it'll frighten them, but instead of terrifying them into impotence and confusion, it will affirm the fact that you knew what you were doing. And that will make them happy, because they say we can turn to somebody who told us the truth. They told us it was going to happen. It's now happening. Maybe that's our door out. And that's what I represent. And that's what we've got to work on. That's what I propose to you, why I've said the things the way I've said them tonight, is what I think we have to work on. Not just me work on it. Of course I work on it. But we have to work on the kind of dialogue we need to deal with the generational problem, the Hamlet problem, and the related things. And get a sense of what the United States is, what it is historically, not the way it's behaved at various times, but what it is historically. What is this nation? Yes, it's the most powerful nation on this planet. What are we going to do with it? What's the purpose we want to use it for? In domestic affairs and world affairs. And you are senior people. You've been there, you're organizing, you're committed. You know what it is to organize. And it's among us and people like us, bringing us together, that we will decide what is the best course of action to organize and bring people together around what we're trying to do. That's what I have to say. My boss.
Okay, so let me just make a very short announcement. We have literature outside to help you in your organizing. People can take as much as they want with them. Also, I know some people are interested in having a tape of tonight's performance, discussion by Mr. LaRouche. If there are other tapes you're also interested in, please leave your name at the table with the people out there, so that we can give you the most material to help in the organizing in this period up to the primary and the period after the primary towards the general election, which we will be very actively involved here in Alabama. So those are my short announcements. I think we should have a dialogue, as Mr. LaRouche suggests, to deal with these issues. We have a microphone right behind our dear friend Juanita Kendi, and please take the microphone, identify who you are, ask a question, and we'll get into a good discussion. So whoever wants to take the first step, it's right over here. Yes, sir.
Testing.
Yeah.
Pastor William L. Wallace. I have a question for you, sir.
Right.
Because I don't today believe in the Republican and Democratic Party as a whole, why are we still trying to maintain our status in supporting those parties, not look toward a third party or a foreign party?
Because what we have to do at this time is we have to win the crisis that is going to decide the fate of the world is going to come now. That is, I don't know exactly how rapidly, but it's here. It's already in progress. The only agency on this planet which can activate the needed solution is the government of the United States. So the question here is, how do we shape the government of the United States now to solve the problem? Third-party politics pertain to a future. They pertain to a train which is going to a chasm over which there is no bridge. Even though the destination might be fine, you'll never get there. So therefore, it's a waste of effort. Now, what can be done in that direction is something else, which is what I've done before and what we have to do now. In the case that, you know, as I say in Atlanta, Georgia, if you want to be successful, you have to learn the methods of General William Tecumseh Sherman. Right? Sometimes, Sherman is very famous in military history internationally. He's probably one of the greatest military geniuses that lived in modern times, as the ghost of Wiley Joe Johnson would attest, the one that Sherman beat all the way through this territory on the way to Atlanta. Huh? Because Sherman flanked him all the way. And then Johnson was so flanked that he never was quite sure where Sherman was, even though Sherman was right beside him. And you can read in the history of those battles of Sherman's campaign, the anvil and hammer, where Sherman was the hammer and Grant was the anvil. Right? And it cracked it. It destroyed the Confederacy. Now, we're dealing with a similar problem today. There are methods of which we can flank this problem. I'll take a case of 1964. Let's take Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Was that a good tactic? Of course it was. It flanked the situation. It attacked the Democratic Party. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I am about to sue, not on my behalf, but on the part of my voters, Don Fowler, for violation of the Voters' Rights Act, because he's deprived my voters of their rights to representation. And I'm going to take him into federal court. I'm not going to bother messing with, fooling around with the states. They didn't do it. He did it. I'm going to take his scalp. That's a flanking operation. If some people here in these states, because they are being mistreated by the Democratic leadership, want to use any tactic they can to force the Democratic Party to do its job, do it. Just make it sensible. Just like the Mississippi Freedom Democrats did. So I don't object to independent thing. But the point is, don't lose it. You see, you've got an operation going around. Two people I know to be government agents. I speak frankly here. We're all friends, so I'm speaking nothing but the plain truth, holding nothing back. One is Ross Perot. I can read your dossier right from his dossier right from my mind. I know what it is. Another one is Lenora Fulani, whose dossier I can also read. Another one they're in bed with, you can imagine Lenora Fulani in bed with Ross Perot, those big flapping ears there, right? And Larry Pratt. Buchanan's, the guy who was kicked out of Buchanan's organization for being too close to the Ku Klux Klan types, right? That's quite a pack of people, isn't it? Quite a combination. Now, I happen to know that the organization which Lenora Fulani represents is a government operation. You had a fellow Tisdale, who's known to some of you, from Jackson, Mississippi, who said that with proof in hand, and her organization sued him for $2 million, and he beat them because he had the proof in hand. He had the checks to prove it. Alfred Newman's, or Edward Newman's organization, which he's a part of, is a government operation. Ross Perot is a government operation. What they're trying to do is to capitalize on the folly of Clinton in allowing the Democratic National Committee and Jesse Jackson to play games, to do everything possible to estrange the African American vote from the administration. Huh? So therefore, are we going to be suckers for them because the president's playing the fool? No, we're not going to be suckers. We're going to do it, fight the battle our way, not the way government agents like Ross Perot. Let me tell you about Ross Perot, just in case you might want to know this for reference. Ross Perot was a talented, despite his years, was a talented graduate of the military academy. But he was money hungry. So his friends decided to use him. So they put him to work as an IBM salesman. Let him out of his service. He went out as an IBM salesman. Then they put him up into business in a service bureau with Blue Cross Blue Shield contracts and other things like that, for the OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity contracts and so forth, doing audits, machine audits, printout audits. Then in the end of the 1960s, he went to people, including Solomon Brothers, and he got a public offering for his corporation to go public. He became very, very rich on that deal. Then he was given other deals, and he became richer and richer, a billionaire. And then his government came to him and said, Ross, we've done a great deal for you. Now, we want you to spend some money for your government on things that your government does not want to be caught spending money for. Huh? That's how Jesse Jackson got to Syria. Huh? And things like that. So the point is, you got a bunch of government agents, and Ross was a government agent doing a good job, in a sense, in 1992, because it was recognized, even the establishment, that George Bush was clinically insane. And the idea of re-electing a clinically insane George Bush, who refused to resign, despite his insanity, just they couldn't do that. So they threw Perot in to ensure that George Bush would not be re-elected. That's how Clinton got elected. And now they're using this combination to try to pull off African American and other vote on the basis of discontent, on the basis of a guy called Larry Nichols, who was a lying British agent, who's part of the picture. He's a lying British agent who was controlled by British intelligence, and Larry Nichols I know to be a liar up and down. And he's being used for the same thing. That whole operation to the American Spectator, British intelligence, fully, allied with George Bush. Right? So that's the game. So they're playing a game to try to screw up the possibility of the United States having a solid presidency, and a Congress. And so we're not going to play the game. Whatever you can do, however, that makes sense in that environment to further the cause, including independent tactics, yeah, do it. Consider it. It should be considered and discussed. Whatever will further the cause, that's what counts.
Yes, sir.
My name is Tommy Wren. And what you were saying, Mr. LaRoche, see, Bevel, Jim Bevel and I've been personal friends for 30 years. So I know what you're talking about. But what bothers me, and I want to know, how can we do this? I find that going around that we are so dumbfounded about the American revolutionary principles in the Constitution, particularly Article 1, 2, and 3, the executive, the Congress, and the judiciary. And if Clinton is crazy enough to allow some folks to separate his thinking from the Congress, which the Congress is the representative of the people, and he's the executive to execute the law, and the judiciary. And now if he's so messed up in the mind for someone to separate him from me, the people, then he's in trouble. Now how do we organize to show our people what is happening here if he's going to cut himself off from the people?
Well, some people in the New South Coalition understood exactly what I was saying when I discussed the matter of addressing this problem with them. They're saying, what can we do about the situation? I said, well, the president's already won the nomination, so he doesn't need any more endorsement here. If you want to be smart, give me an endorsement, and that will do what has to be done. But then there was people who are running campaigns who need money from the Democratic National Committee. And the problem was that those people needed money, and they were afraid that if they endorsed me, that they wouldn't get the money and wouldn't get the help. And therefore, the pressure was put on, okay, so they endorsed the Clinton and gave me a nice honorable mention there, which will do some good, actually. Right? It will do some good. Now, Clinton doesn't hate me. I mean, you know, he knows we're different and so forth. But he recognizes, or his people recognize things. And so, therefore, it's not, the problem is not that he's the enemy. The problem is he's Bubba. And the problem is, given the weakness, is how do you shape the environment to bring about the result? And that has happened in history before. I'm more qualified to be president than anybody who's been living in the past 40 years for this job, because I know what needs to be done. And I'm perfectly capable of doing it. We could get the job done. But because the establishment has turned so many Americans into frightened sheep for so long and been able to herd them around the way they wanted to, and because the enemy recognizes that I'm the thing that he fears the most, and that's not exaggeration, the enemy has said, keep him away from power. That's why they framed me up and threw the jug. They had a choice of killing me or framing me up. And they decided they didn't want to make a martyr out of me, so the last minute they decided not to kill me, but put the jug instead. So, because they're afraid of me. So therefore I say, okay, that's the situation. Oh, you play the game. You got the institutions fixed so I don't get the presidency. Well, I'm going to cheat you. I'm going to pull a Sherman on you. I'm going to flank you. And therefore, where I'm going to help just do what I should do anyway, is take all the people I agree with and help us build a machine which can control the presidency. And we've got allies in the Democratic Party in Washington and so forth. And Clinton, in a sense, is an ally. He wants to play Bubba games and look for the pragmatic solution. We must become the pragmatic solution. That's it. Yeah.
This is a long story of the fact that goodness and defeat is better than evil triumph.
That's right.
So I would take goodness and defeat better than evil triumph. This is a long story of the fact. Cease from the occupy the palace, Christ the cross, but often as Christ will rise and split history into two parts. And even the likes of Caesar must be dated by
absolutely.
Until we get that kind of faith, we will have no
well, I find that's the cup I have to drink from. We have to do that. That's yeah, I agree. Yes, we do. I would need that.
Mr. LaRouche, I've known you since 1977.
Yeah.
So I go way back with you. And I know of your intimacy with education, with knowledge, with the knowledge of not just the United States, but the knowledge of the world. So that, to me, that makes you a greater man for the presidency. However, under the circumstances, with the Democratic Party in the condition that it is, we have to find a way in which we can bring the Democratic Party, not just the few who know what you can do, around to your way of thinking in order to maintain and to bring the Democratic Party back into existence against the Newt Gingriches and against the Doles and against the others who are out there with actually nothing. And I think today you must leave with Birmingham what we can do in order to, and I know you will reiterate some of the things that you have said, but even with reiterating that, we're going to have to go further. We're going to have to go deeper if we are to maintain the Democratic Party, not only the Democratic Party, but democracy, so that we will be able to live. As it is, we're not really living. We've got our people walking the streets. We've got them stealing. We've got them with dope. We've got them with everything else, but looking forward to the training of the young and that type of thing. Every day there's somebody dying, there's somebody killing, there's somebody doing for no reason. So you, right now, are our leader to tell us how we can bring ourselves together in order to combat what is out here?
Well, first of all, I would take two things. I would take two reference points: Martin Luther King and Alabama. The second great event in my lifetime in the United States was the civil rights movement, which was created actually here. Okay? Now, what's happened is Martin was killed. Now, Martin had, people who know him, had a special quality, which when J.L. raised the question in the hearings last year on this question, I said, I had never met Martin directly, though I watched him closely. But the people here and in Alabama who knew him very well, who were very close to him. And I've discussed this matter with all of them at different times, including Amelia and so forth. Now, it's obvious when I saw Martin, what he was doing, I recognized exactly what he's doing. Now, see, Martin is a real Christian. Apart from being a Baptist, he's a real Christian. Because he was able to understand what it is, what the shadow of the cross meant to him. And I don't know what Martin did in all his total life, but I know that when he was doing something for the movement, everything I saw, he was a man of purity in that. He was a man of pure dedication. And he became more so as time passed. Because you do good, you get gooder. Now, he was something special to the movement. He became indispensable. Because see what Martin did constantly with all the people around him, working around him. Martin had a very special role. He could go into Gethsemane and look at the cup and drink of it. The cup of not being Hamlet. The problem is the Hamlet problem existed in the movement. Even among good people, you had good Hamlets. But they couldn't rise to the next level, the next higher level. And Martin did that. It was Martin who took the idea of the nation, the United States, who made that the keystone of the movement. He said what? This United States, the Declaration of Independence in particular was what he emphasized, was dedicated to certain principles. These principles are correct principles. We are bringing about the realization of those principles for all mankind. And that's what made him dangerous, because he was not talking about a bunch of victims demanding compensation for victimization. Not like the crazies of the so-called, black militants. They're crazy. They were super energized victims. They were not heroes. Martin was a hero because he said, we are going to save this nation and the world by realizing the purpose of this nation. And that was stunning information when he did it. The moment he died, before he was going to be killed, look what he did. He did go to the mountaintop. And others couldn't get out of the Hamlet skin to do the same thing. So he had people around him who all had functioned beautifully with him, with all the quarrels and schisms and so forth that had gone on frictionally within. But when he was gone, they ran in different directions to different foundations. With Jesse first to Chicago before anybody else knew where he was. And that's the point. That's the point. So here what you have here in Alabama, you have the core of the tradition of what Martin did, the core of the greatest event since the World War II in the history of the United States is here. It's in Birmingham. It's in Montgomery. It's in Selma. It's here. It's yours. You have it. I embrace it. Let's put it together again. Let's affirm that, not as some kind of passive ceremonial thing. Yeah, Martin Luther King Day is good, but whoever learned the lesson of it? You know it. You in the room, you know this. You were there, you saw it, you experienced it. I meet people, look, you meet people down the gym knew down to various these meetings. Right? Met with them a couple of times. They're all friends. Who were they? Some of these people who were leaders of civil rights in Alabama today were as children in jail under Jim Bevel's operation of the children. Right? They're some of the best leaders in the world today. They're good people. They have the frustrations that all of you express. Where are we going? Where are we going? Where are we going? I said, you have to go to what you are. You already are that. You embody a tradition in the United States which is not a protest tradition. Our problem is a world that is about to die, a world that's about to go into a dark age, not an apocalypse, but an apocalyptic period, a long dark age of punishment for mankind's failure to meet the standard he must meet. And the question is, who will lead this world away from this evil? Who is going to lead us out of the night? Well, the United States is the most powerful nation on this planet. Our constitutional principle on which the nation is founded is the right principle to do it. We have the principle, we have the power. How are we going to do it? Martin was right. You have to take these principles and seize them, and even let the least become most to lead in getting the United States to do what it must do for the sake of all humanity. Look, what we have to do, what I'm involved in. Helga was in China. That's part of the process. She was there speaking at a conference and participating in a conference in China. And one of the reasons she was there was because they were afraid to invite me. Not because of what I would do to China, but because of what some people in the United States might do to China if I were there. In the same period, Helga and I were in Moscow for an important conference, which I addressed. And we have friends in the Sudan. We try to defend Nigeria against these people trying to kill it. We're defending all kinds of countries in this world, sometimes without much. We know this aching world. I know it personally. They need the United States to do the right thing as a world leader to start to bring some order in this planet. We're going to have to meet with the Russians, or hopefully, and the Chinese and others. The President of the United States is going to have to do that in order to establish a new monetary system under which we can get this world back into some kind of order. The way Martin spoke of it just before he died. That's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to do it. It's not just a slogan. It's something we have to do. Postpone business, delayed business. I've been working to establish the pathway by which this can be brought about, this kind of conference and effort. What you have to do is, I was at a Baptist church here in Birmingham today, and the preacher had something on the don't underestimate yourself. Don't proceed from low esteem. It's right. The problem with you people here in Alabama, you proceed from too low in self-esteem. You don't realize how important you are. Once you realize how important you are because you bear a special part of a tradition in this state, one of the lowest states in the United States in a couple of senses, right? That you made it for a while the foremost state in the United States. Because it was the state of Martin's leadership, the state of the struggle across the Pettus Bridge, and so forth. The things that made this civil rights movement function, that got 2 acts out of a president who was otherwise reluctant for civil rights, who made a mark on history that cannot yet be eradicated. Why should you have low esteem? You have within you those qualities which you once showed, and you have allowed yourself to be shrunken, to be made little and of lower esteem than you should be. My problem with Americans is they get cowardly and they lose self-esteem. And you here in this room typify those in this state and in neighboring states who can do this, who can affirm this, get by the tiddlywinks and get back to the reality. Get by the little special projects, this deal, that deal, this caper, this gimmick, that gimmick. It's not going to work. What's going to work is revive the tradition and say, Barton is back, he's here again. Because we bring him back to life. Where what he started has to be continued. This state has to appreciate itself as a hero. That's its power. When it affirms and asserts that heritage of its heroism, its dignity, its accomplishment, then you will find within the state you have the people who will awaken and arise to something higher than what they're doing right now.
Yes, Mr. LaRouche, my name is Viola Hassan, and I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I've been here for about 20 years in the state of Alabama, and I've been a part of the Alabama Democratic Party. And I do have a question, and I'm from the generation that asks a lot of questions. And you said a few things that I want to clear up in my head, and I followed you for a long time, and I think I've just about read everything you've written. My question is, you mentioned global economy. Are you saying that we should put that on the back burner now, or?
No. By this, the beginning of mankind's freedom from general slavery occurred in the 15th century in Europe. It occurred as a result of a long process leading up into this, which included education of orphans and boys from poor families in a classical education, which established from among the ranks of the poor an intelligentsia. And out of this came the idea that instead of having nations which were controlled by feudal or other oligarchies, in which most people were human cattle, and they culled them like cattle, just the way they want to do it today. Instead, you had nations which were nations of all the people. You know, as the Frederick Douglass effort, the first step of freedom from slavery is literacy, education. Freedom is knowledge. Knowledge is freedom, the power of knowledge. This was made possible by the establishment of the first form of modern nation state, which occurred in France between 1461 and 1483, under Louis XI of France, who was selected by a group in Italy, the same group that supported Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, and selected him as the crown prince, the Dauphin of France, to be trained to become the future king of France as the successor to his father, to make France a nation state. And that was the first modern nation state. He began the first steps toward universal education by the state sponsorship, with schools which are modeled on a classical education, the brotherhood of the common life. He began a project of building public works to unify the nation, promoting economic development. During his reign of about 22 years, the national income of France doubled, and the first nation state occurred. So the process of bringing people into a combination of education and using knowledge to change the way we behave in order to increase our powers over nature began there. The United States, established during the 18th century, was in that tradition. It had nothing to do with this Locke or nonsense. That Locke is a slaveholder. It had nothing to do with the United States. What the Democratic Party often teaches is a bunch of crap. It's not true. The United States was founded by people who realized that we had lost the battle in England, particularly in 1714, earlier in 1603, but 1714, and came here, as they did also in part from France, to build a nation of the type that they believed could not be built in Netherlands or England. And they formed colonies which were not colonies of the British Parliament, but were simply crown entities, commonwealths in large degree. States which were semi-autonomous states, their own government, with certain fealty to the British monarch, which were based on constitutional orders, which were consistent with the idea of the nation state. For example, the first printed money, successful use of printed money as a currency, occurred in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the 17th century. That was the model for which the relevant features of our Constitution were established. Now, in this process, the motive was clear behind the formation of the federal Constitution, that states' rights don't work. States' rights are the road to death of a nation. That it's only the federal government which could ensure the development of roads, canals, and other infrastructure the protection of a national currency and its regulation, the regulation of tariffs and trade, the promotion of inventions, the national defense, and so forth, that this state was essential to accomplish the purposes of life. Thus, the nation state, which until 1966, 1970, was the aspiration of people all over the world to have a nation state, a sovereign nation state with the right to make tariffs, the right to reject NAFTA, the right to reject GATT, and things like that, and to create infrastructure, to have public educational systems, to promote inventions. This is what people desired all over the world, and they looked to the United States as the model. What has happened is, in a recent period of time, people who believe in world government will tell you they're trying to destroy big government in order to establish the power of bigger government, world government, the United Nations as world government. There are many people today who in the State Department would say we should have world government. There are people who say, and when they say global economy, they mean that we should produce only where it's the cheapest, which means that we should ship our jobs out of the United States to wherever the slave labor is willing to work for the cheapest price. We are destroying ourselves with that. We're destroying the world. We must go back to a non-global economy, a non-global society. We should turn the United Nations into a picnic grounds, not a government. Let the diplomats who can't talk to each other otherwise have a place to meet and discuss. That's fine. But it should have no governmental authority whatsoever. Every nation state must be absolutely sovereign. Only in that way can the rights of the individual be secured. Only with a nation state can the citizen be a citizen. Can the citizen participate in government? Under a global economy, you have no control over anything. Only the international oligarchy controls things. So therefore, having a government, our government, which we must control, according to constitutional principles, is the essential thing, protection of our rights as an individual and the protection of our economy.
I have one more question, please.
One, the physical production worldwide as well as in the United States has gone down per capita. Over the same period, the amount of money put into circulation has gone up. In the same period, in addition to money going up, we have gone into real estate and financial speculation of a new order. This speculation is a giant financial bubble which is ready to pop. And when it pops, it's going to splatter all over us. Huh? No banking system, no economy, no nothing. Therefore, what you have to do is like having the whole local economy bankrupt, you have to put it into bankruptcy reorganization, which means the president has emergency powers. So the president one day says, okay, under my emergency powers from down here, which you voted for in the 1970s in various legislation, I'm putting the Federal Reserve System into bankruptcy because it's bankrupt. Because it never could pay the obligations which it's incurred. Therefore, it's bankrupt. And if I let it go, it's only going to be worse. So put it in bankrupt. Put it in mercy. Give it, call Dr. Kevorkian, right? Whatever. Right? You got a case for him. Now, what you have to do, you can't go without a banking system. So the banking system has issued money, U.S. dollars, Federal Reserve notes, in the name of the U.S. government as legal tender. But you can't call that in. Leave that alone. You might exchange it for new currency at some point. But you want to do the quickest things you can do with the least complication. Because if you make it more complicated, like Hillary Clinton's crazy health bill, it'll never get through. Make it complicated, won't work. Too complicated to function. Don't design a complicated cow. It won't give milk. You just kick the bucket over. Right? So you want to get the job done. So put it in bankruptcy, receivership, which means you freeze everything the same way you put a local bank into bankruptcy. Same principle, just on a higher level. Right. Then the president the same day goes to the Congress and says, I want emergency legislation from you bums under Article 1. Two pieces of emergency legislation. Number one, new currency issue. Article 1 provides for it. The Congress shall pass the laws which authorize the issue of currency, treasury currency. And that is paper money. Now, some people will tell you paper money is not legal under the Constitution. That's not true. What is not legal is the printing of paper money by states. That's illegal. Because the federal government has a monopoly on that. The states are only allowed to print specie, not paper money. The federal government alone has a monopoly on that. We get several $1 trillion of it. Authorization of the Treasury to print paper money. Also, bank. National Banking Act. National Banking Act will set up national banking to replace central banking, Federal Reserve banking. Now, the function is the national bank must take the currency which the government prints, and it's going to loan it as credit. In other words, the government is creating credit to issue to our citizens. Now, this credit will go out on the basis of terms which are probably agreed to between the Congress and the President. The idea is that we take certain major projects, which come under Item 3, National Recovery Act. We take certain list of projects, such as known established projects. Take Tom Bigby. Now, Tom Bigby should be completed and expanded in this area. It's easy to do because the plans are already there, which means that if you get the bill through, you can start hiring tomorrow, and you can start taking subcontracts out tomorrow. It means you combine the Tom Bigby project with a power project. We need a lot of power in this area if we're going to reindustrialize. So we'll put some power plants into the package. We'll also add some other environmental things that have to be done at the same time, and some provision. So we're going to stimulate this area, for example, and do the same thing in other parts of the country. Get people to work. Now, at the same time, we've got to have a new international monetary system because we've got to put the IMF out of business. Again, Dr. Kevorkian got another case for you. IMF. Close it down. Because, and how do we do that? Well, the president will call, as this measure, an international monetary conference, which will include several world powers. It will allow the British Empire to come, because we're going to kick them, and if they're there, it's easier to kick them. Secondly, we're going to invite the Russians. We're going to invite the Chinese. Now that completes the list of world powers. There are no other world powers. Then you have a lot of other nations, Western Europe, other parts of the world, India and so forth. So you invite them too. You can have a monetary conference. You want to keep it simple as James Carville would like to keep it, practically. He likes to keep things simple. And simple is, we are going back to the system of fixed parities of currencies that we established under the Bretton Woods Agreement. And we're going to have a gold reserve-based system to stabilize those currencies. And we'll figure out how we're going to do that. Also, we're going to cease the business of central banking, that is private banking. We're going to have only government banks, national banks. We'll have an international system of national banking and regulated currency regulation, monetary system, under which to promote international trade and investment at low borrowing costs. And that will do it. All you have to do is get some madman like me up there saying, let's get the jobs going, and you put a measure on. What I did some years ago, I said 6 million jobs a year. Get rid of those hamburger flipping jobs, those service jobs, and get some real jobs in the economy to absorb the unemployed and the misemployed. And have a target, say something like 6 million or whatever, a figure that makes sense, a year, new jobs. And the job is to get the credit going out there, and we used even the bankrupt local banks. Say, you're bankrupt, okay, we'll put you in government receivership. You're a decent banker, it's not your fault, okay, stay here. You know your local customers. What we're going to do with you under this Banking Reorganization Act, we are going to set you up back in the banking business. You've got some deposits and other things you've got to pay off. We'll help you with that, with credit. What you're going to do is you're going to process government loans to your local customers for purposes which we'll designate to you at your rates. Now, if you get some deposits, you can also participate, say 1%, 2%, whatever, in these loans, because you can take a part of the loans. And that'll get you back in business because we need a local bank. Because only the local banker knows which customer is which. So we need local bankers. So we'll set that into place. And on that basis, get the jobs going. Get the country moving. We did it before in World War II. You pick out what we did in World War II. We made a lot of mistakes. We made a lot of mess. But it worked. And that's what we're going to have to do. Make a lot of mess, make a lot of mistakes, but it's going to work. And people will be happy because they will see things are getting better. John?
I have one question. I don't intend to interrupt, but we're going, the way we're going is just right. But I know of one person that seemed to have caught a lot of people's imagination. And we don't hear anything about him now. what has happened to Colin Powell? Will he be able? He had one idea, it seems to me, and that was to get people back to working together. I think that's why he was so popular. But now, we can get along without him if we have you. But I know you already know that you can get folk to work. But I want to hear about Powell.
Okay,
I want to know
fine.
what's happened to him.
I got a sad story to tell you about Powell. It's a true story, but it's a sad one. Colin is not called Sir Colin Powell. He's called General Sir Colin Powell because he did such wonderful work for the British Queen in killing people of darker skin in the Middle East. Now, Colin Powell's popularity, I'll tell you who gave him his popularity. There was a certain group of people. There was a fellow whose grandfather was a founder of the Ku Klux Klan. It was named Bernie Baruch. He was very famous in my time. And Bernie Baruch was the banker who banked for Churchill. He saved Churchill's butt. See, Churchill was part American. He married a family in Virginia. His father did. And he was close to the Guest family, which is one of the local swine we have up in Virginia. You didn't know we raise swine. They're two-legged. They're called oligarchs, and they ride horses and chase foxes and things like that. All right, so the Guest family is called. One of the Guest family members was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. You can imagine what that is. But in any case, so Colin, this Bernie Baruch, when the time came that the United States entered World War II and for the operations in Europe, that it was obvious that the United States would not accept anything but an American commander of the Joint Allied Forces for Europe. So Churchill pulled a fast one. He said, okay, I got to take an American commander. Which one will I take? And so Bernie Baruch said, I own one. Colonel Eisenhower. Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, who I bought or I stole away for a few pennies from Douglas MacArthur, for whom he used to clerk. So that's how and so Churchill said, okay, we'll pull that slick one. So they got Dwight Eisenhower adopted as acceptable to the British commander of the Allied forces in Europe. Then at the time, after they got rid of MacArthur, which was done by Truman on orders from London, that Eisenhower was brought back to the United States by Bernie Baruch. And Bernie Baruch rigged the convention to get Eisenhower the Republican nomination, and Bernie Baruch organized the forces to make Eisenhower president, or as I call him, Dwight Eisenhower. Because he was a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Now, Colin Powell, even though Bernie Baruch is dead, his dirty ghost rattles on. And the people who, for Bernie Baruch, put Eisenhower in that position own Colin Powell. That's why Colin Powell, because doing that dirty job for the Queen of England in Desert Storm, got a knighthood. People are bought, in various ways.
Thank you. My name is Richard Boone, and I'm just wondering, I want to ask this question, if the atonement, which I'm aware that you played a great part in bringing about, led by Minister Farrakhan, is a part of the continuing program at this point to reestablish the dream of the movement in America. It seems that there are a lot of Hamlets out there hung up on several things, but we can lick this ghost if we can just establish the dream once again. The dreamer is dead, but that does not necessarily kill the dream.
Yeah.
A lot of people are not aware of what the dream really is of Martin King. It's not black people and white people walking together, but it's black people and white people working together. Yeah. Therefore, we have forgotten the part where Martin tells us, if you see a man in distress, do not stop to ask the question, if I stop to help him, what will happen to me? But rather you must ask, if I don't stop to help America or this person, what will happen to it or to him? Is your program as president geared toward healing this problem and bringing us back into the central focal point of the dream?
Absolutely, but I don't think practical measures alone will do it. I think that in a time of conflict, it's very easy to get alliances of people who recognize they have a common interest and who will ally out of a kind of a negative motivation of realizing that they have to ally because of what will happen if they don't. But the question of solving and healing the problem in the real sense of atonement, I don't think comes from that alone. I think that creates the setting in which the problem can be attacked. I think the real thing comes in part through education, but not education the way people talk about it. I think humanist education. See, the key thing here is somebody came up with a crazy idea that there's such a thing as race among human beings. Now, every evidence that I know is that there is no such thing as a sub-race in the human race. It doesn't exist. Because what's a human being? A human being is a person, an individual, who can perform the cognitive functions which we call discovery, which no animal can perform. And in our knowledge and our demonstration of the fact there is no difference in any part of the human family in respect to that potential, that all human beings have the same potential. For example, the racists at Harvard University, and Harvard University Education Department is the center of organized racism in the United States today, as it is the center of Ritalin, which is pretty much the same thing. Huh? That will say that the African American does not like to think cognitively, but likes to think associatively and emotionally, which is a pile of crap. And any time we see people, African Americans, who have achievement, or like George Washington Carver, for example, not far from here, you see that the quality of genius makes no such racial distinctions, but circumstances, education, and nurture, and sometimes very strange ways, does it. Now, the problem is we live in a society where people say people should be educated for the job they're going to have. Oh, this one is going to be he's going to be a carpenter, so let's educate him to be a carpenter. We don't need to educate him in anything else. But once you get to the idea of humanist education for citizenship, to bring forth so every person should be a repository of the discoveries of mankind up to that time as children, and the education should continue until that primary goal is realized, and then a person is qualified to vote when they've done that, because they're now a true citizen. Once you get to that point and realize that in the sharing of the cognitive aspect of humanity, as opposed to the muscular aspect of humanity, then you realize that this withers away, because it was never true and it's always been a mistake. And only when people prize their own cognitive powers as being humanity. For example, they take a little simple thing that every adolescent goes through, every child adolescent. Little girls especially. Am I pretty? Am I pretty? The self-esteem is associated with the degree of which one perceives oneself to be pretty. Or am I able to dress well? Do I look good? Can I afford to look good? Can I live in a neighborhood where I look good? Huh? Do I have the right friends, the smart friends? Can I get into the country club? Do I get my name in the right society page of the newspaper or whatever? Or do I win the race? You're a fast runner? I got a horse that can beat you. Huh? These things are not the things that mark a human being, but rather cognition, the sharing of ideas. And when we can learn the principle of that, and as I say, the principle of agape, the way Plato describes it, the way the Gospel of John emphasizes it, and also Paul in the epistles. When you get people to that level, that kind of education, then it doesn't make any difference. Then the healing is there. The teaching is there. And that's what we have to get to. I think, however, that the context of the alliance is the way to do it. When you're fighting with your brother in the same trench, you tend to get kind of close and begin to try to look for similarities rather than differences.
She's ready. Sure. Madam, do you want to answer that? No, I think oh, okay. I have two questions. I'm James Mays from Georgia, an admirer and a critic. and I think of you as one of the most intellectual people who has ever ran for president.
You've got a little trouble.
My first question is concerning the Dole leaving the Senate to re-identify himself, to re-establish himself as a presidential candidate. It appeared to me that by doing that, he is saying that that the Republican Party and himself has different objectives, and it appeared to me that would weaken the party rather than strengthen it, and it appeared that would be something that the Democrats could take advantage of. The other question, I'd like your comment on that. The other question is, I watched 60 Minutes this past Sunday night, and Madeleine Albright, the ambassador to the United Nations, I guess, was saying that it was hard, but the United States had to deny the babies and the hospitals and the people of Iraq food and medicine to live. Isn't that, I considered it just as that what Hitler did was no worse. Or isn't that on the same scale or the same measure of degradation? And I'd like your comment on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, on the question of this Dole business, I think that what happened with Dole, that Dole was maneuvered by Trent Lott. Trent Lott is a really sneaky, I understand from some good friends from Mississippi that they've got something just as bad down there, or worse. But that's probably true. But Trent, for the moment, Trent will do as badness. He's got more than his quota. He's a controlled entity. Now, Trent Lott is fairly described as the Newt Gingrich of the Senate. That he's a slippery chameleon who would probably, if you put him on a Scotch plaid, would start to make speeches in a burr. He's totally used, a tool. Just like Newt Gingrich. You look at Newt Gingrich's history. Newt Gingrich is not a person you can buy. He's a professional. You can only rent him by the hour, so to speak, like some other politicians I know. So, and Newt Gingrich is a property of a British operation, which is the same thing as the American Spectator, the neoconservative operation, which is literally a fascist operation in the United States. Trent Lott is owned by the same people, the people that control it. On the surface, the argument was that Dole was his life was so complicated by trying to be leader of the Senate under the pressure of the Gingrichites that fighting off the fleas of Gingrichism was interfering with his ability to campaign effectively, because he had to represent the Senate and the Gingrich crowd the Senate at the same time trying to represent himself. What really the case is, as I see the thing, is there was a maneuver which had been in progress for some time to get Dole out of the Senate in order to put Trent Lott in as the leader of the Senate, majority leader. Now, Trent Lott is nothing. I know a good deal about Trent Lott, not everything, but I know enough to know what he is. He's nothing. He's a zero, but a dangerous zero, like Newt Gingrich is nothing. There's nothing to him. He has no character, but he's used. He's old and he's used. Now, just think about having a Newt Gingrich type in the Senate. This time it's a real slime ball, to use a term of euphemism. That can be very damaging. Now, what these guys are up to has nothing to do with Dole. This tends to suggest that some people have written off the presidential race, which means they'll be concentrating on, that is, they're prepared to concede the race at this time to Clinton. And their options are very clear. If they concede to Clinton, and if Clinton, two ways they can get Clinton out. If they can't get him out by election, there's another way of getting him out, two other ways. One, and I won't talk about one, but they will think about that. Yeah? The other is, who is Clinton's running mate? Al Gore. Al Gore is acceptable to Clinton's enemies. And they can get him out by impeachment or by framing up a conviction, as in the Whitewater case. Completely fraudulent, but they can get by with it. You don't have to be guilty of anything to be convicted in this country these days. Huh? You don't. It's very easy with this Justice Department. And with Janet Reno in the Justice Department, he's got no protection on his back, as we've seen already. She may wrestle with alligators, but I don't know what she's doing. But she can't wrestle with the ones in Washington, I'll tell you that. So anyway, or they can get him out. If we don't get the House of Representatives, they'll get him by impeachment next year. In other words, if they don't get him out by a criminal indictment leading to impeachment, they'll get him out by impeachment next year if they control the House of Representatives. And if you have a Trent Lott, remember how the thing works in an impeachment proceeding. If you have Trent Lott as majority leader of the Senate, they'll pull it off. The second part, the
other question was the denying of the people in Iraq.
Oh, Iraqi, right. That's straight mass murder. The way to do it is the law laid down in Nuremberg, which was drafted by a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, is that if a public official or a member of certain professions were to produce a policy which caused others to act in such a way as to bring about an increase in the death rate in a targeted group of people, that person is guilty of a capital offense of crimes against humanity. That's the Nuremberg Code. Now, in the case of Virginia, in the case of Pennsylvania, we have a Governor Ridge. I like to think of him as Governor Ridgeback, if you know what I mean, who had tried a short time ago, to get a bill through which would have deprived about, some 300,000 people of protection of health care, that is, people who need it. And I attacked this and said this is a crime against humanity. And my friends took that message to the Pennsylvania legislature. Now, in the legislature, there were 100 Democrats and 101 Republicans. At that point, all but one or two Republicans were going to vote for this bill, and a number of Democrats were going to go along with it. On the interest, we got to balance the budget, haven't we? Right. So we put this message in. Well, anybody who does that, if you do that, then you are guilty under the Nuremberg Code of a crime against humanity, because you have willfully and with foreknowledge, or should know, that the policy you are adopting will cause the wrongful death rate increase among this population of people. Therefore, you're just like somebody who ordered killing in a concentration camp. No difference. So that worked. What happened is the Democrats went solid in opposition, and they got 20 Republicans to go along with them, and they defeated. Now, Ridgeback is coming back with another version of the same legislation. And I'm going after him again for crimes against humanity and repeatedly advocating this. In the case of the policy against Iraq, unjustified warfare, and there is such a thing as unjustified warfare as opposed to justified warfare. There is no justification for what's being done to Iraq. It is mass murderous. You are right. It is a Hitler-like crime against humanity, perpetrated by the United Nations, which also was guilty of Hitler-like crimes against humanity in the Balkans, in its conduct of the Balkan Wars. Cyrus Vance was guilty, American citizen who worked for that. Lord Carrington was guilty. Kissinger Associates helped set the operation up years ago for money. They're guilty. So yes, it is a crime against humanity.
Again, Pastor William L. Wallace. The gentleman before mentioned Minister Farrakhan's Day of Atonement. What part did you play in that process?
Well, what happened is Jim Bevel talked to me about this, and we had a meeting arranged for me to meet with Farrakhan back in 1994. And so it was with a lot of the leadership of the Nation of Islam together. So Jim was there, and Dennis Speed was there. And for the most of the time, and Jim spoke to me about this idea, about the atonement idea, that he was encouraging Farrakhan to have a million-man march. And I told him I agreed. And Farrakhan said that Jim was pushing it too fast, and I said, well, I think that's true. And I supported the idea of the atonement. So we had a discussion during that meeting at which it was agreed that the march would be based on Jim's proposal on atonement in that meeting we had in Washington. And after that, of course, we were in touch back and forth on this thing constantly. So I supported it. Then there were some people who were very unhappy, including Jesse Jackson, about my involvement in this. They were also unhappy about Farrakhan's involvement in it. He was also. And so things got somewhat pushed aside. Amelia was on the stand representing us at that point. And it didn't always go too well, but Minister Farrakhan was coming under some very severe pressure from various points at that point. So the thing worked. The problem is I've been concerned about, since then, I've talked to him about it. We met again on this. We've been in touch a few times. Yeah, Farrakhan's a friend of mine. We don't always agree on everything, but we're friends. And basically would defend one another, I guess. And so the point is going further. What I'm very concerned about is not going the way it should go. I think it should be much more active. It's not just an NOI project, it's much broader. There were over probably about plus or minus 2 million people there, without doubt. So that's we know what the composition was of the participation in the march. That this is really representative of the African American male community in this country. And it's a very responsible bunch of people who were there, who represent people who were actually looking for something, and this was the image of Martin Luther King really invoked in this point. And that's what got people out. It was, yes, Farrakhan made the call, but the spirit of Martin Luther King actually made it happen in terms of what people had turned out. And I don't think we're doing enough with it. That's what my big concern.
Last point. The reason I mentioned that because I'm from Tuscaloosa, West Alabama. God has given me a vision for a Day of Atonement in Tuscaloosa County coming Sunday. And the call is for 100,000 people to come together, Christian, Muslim, Jews, and to reestablish a vision for a future for our people. It'll be 3 days of atonement, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And what we're trying to do is come together and establish a vision that is clear to move our people forward toward the 21st century.
Beautiful. I think the perfect thing is, in the state of Alabama, I think the image of Martin Luther King is a very useful one for that, because that is what Martin achieved.
Exactly. Also, within the vision of the campus of the University of Alabama, the Quad is the location, and I've caught a few snares trying to secure it with the local county and city government, but we're working through that process, and it's very vital. When you said that, it just sort of quickened my spirit, and I was just interested in what role that you play in
Absolutely.
that.
We need that. We need that, because when people get together, you see what happened in Washington. Well, the problem of what has not happened is we haven't lived up to the promise that was implicit in the Washington March, because for various reasons, difficulties. But the point is, when you bring people together on that basis, they say, hey, wait a minute. Look, we're here.
Right.
We got some power. Now what are we going to do with it?
Exactly.
And therefore the question is, what is the practical measure to which we're going to apply this political power which we found ourselves to represent? Which means immediately, okay, what are we going to do? And therefore carry it forward. In this kind of case, I believe that rather than over-formalized action, what is needed in a period of election campaign is rolling action. Whatever is good, do it. Right. Get it going, and then we'll find ways of bringing it together. Right. We got a lot of people in motion. Just bring it, anything that happens that's good, bring the people together. Exactly. And we'll broaden it. Exactly. And we get some more power. You know, a thing like that can help to win the state of Alabama for the Congress.
Well, that's our intent, to educate the people politically.
Absolutely. Very simply, think in movement terms, not just political organization terms.
It's to bring people to a greater awareness of what's taking place within the state of Alabama. A
sense of their power. Sense, hey, we can be part of something that can actually change the world for the better. That's great stuff. I love that.
I'm Bob Goodwin. I'm sort of concerned about the ultimate outcome of 96 election. The Congress that has made themselves out of such a bunch of fools, I can't see how they could hope to regain, the Republican could hope to regain the Congress. With Dole leaving the Senate, the same thing might happen to the Senate. What's the possibility of a Dole presidency and a Democratic total Senate and Congress?
There are a couple of ways it could happen. Number one, we have the third-party option going. A third-party option of Perot, Fulani, Pratt, and so forth is an amalgam protest vote which targets obviously the Ku Klux Klan, Leona Fulani, we're trying to get some black vote, the militia movement, and whatever Perot can scrape up with money. And these days money buys a lot of people, unfortunately. So it's a very dirty operation, which is really an intelligence community operation against the presidency. The presidency is vulnerable on security. Never overestimate or underestimate the tendency of certain people to use a killer machine for certain purposes. They will. And Dole is an acceptable option to the people who would like to kill Clinton. Don't forget that. So they win then. On Dole as such, Dole could win. I'll tell you how. Very obvious to me. First of all, if Fowler and Dick Morris and company continue to control the president's election policy. The president's, the confidence in the president will drop. If Dole reacts on a Second World War veteran profile, and you have a major financial crisis, and the president continues to scream, there is no crisis, there is prosperity, there is growth, there are problems, but there is growth, there is no crisis, we must stay with the IMF system. Under that condition, the president would discredit himself, and a panicked people in a crisis period might be attracted to Dole because he is a World War II veteran when they no longer trust themselves. So there is a possibility, and there are combinations and permutations of those combinations.
Well, I think we've had a pretty good discussion. I must say that we're very pleased that Mr. LaRouche could come down to Birmingham for the first time. And
I'm pleased.
He's pleased. We're all pleased, and I hope that we can bring him back in the course of the next campaign this year. I would like to let people know again that we have literature available in the back, which includes the latest copy of New Federalist, which has the attacks by Mr. LaRouche against the DNC chairman, Mr. Fowler. And I hope that everyone works towards building our audience for the June 2nd TV show, for the June 4th election, and continues to campaign with us. And please take our literature. Thank you for coming. We've had a wonderful evening.